at a birthday party for a retired spy. And as I was sitting around the table, I realized that I didn't know any of the jobs, the careers that the people at the table did. What exactly does a spy do? And it turns out that retired spies hang out with people like retired diplomats, retired ambassadors, retired people with jobs I actually couldn't even get the names of. I got some, I'm going to tell you. And I'm thinking, well, that's pretty amazing. And as I'm sitting there at the table, I'm watching the spy side. I'm watching at the spy side as Tex is holding court. He is telling a story that is drawing everybody in. And I'm like, well, I got to hear what this story is. And so I walk over and I sit down and I catch the last three quarters of the story. And I'm not going to tell you the story because he might actually be telling it. But the gist of the story, the important point of the story was the fact that as a diplomat, he had used a slow news day and his wiles to implement environmental legislation. And I'm like, wow. And it's important legislation that you all heard of. And I was amazed. And in that moment, I was like, I wish I could have all of my undergraduates at Stony Brook listen to this story. And I didn't have that option, so I called my children over and I made them tell the story again to my kids. And then I'm like, I can't bring them to my classroom, but I could bring them here. And so I invited him, and he was very enthusiastic about this. And so that's how I got the invite. But when I asked him what he wanted me to say in the introduction, he told me this long, funny story about how he was the first one fired from the EPA. And I'm like, okay, that's also a good story, and I'm going to let him tell you the details about that. And then he gave me a list of things he wanted you to know about him before he started speaking. So I'm going to tell you these things. He is affiliated with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. He has been serving as a diplomat for 36 years. He was the former head of intelligence activities at the EPA. Intelligence, I don't know what that abbreviation. I don't know spy abbreviations.
Activities.
Okay, at the EPA in the Clinton area. And he was a foreign policy operator. That was the word I was looking for at the party. I'm like, foreign policy operators? What is that? Who has built diplomatic solutions for, this is what he's worked on, the dirty war in Argentina, ending apartheid in South Africa, food security in Sudan. And Tex and I have had several conversations leading up to today, and he kept leading all the conversations with, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a scientist. And actually, that was number one on the list of things he wanted me to know, wanted me to tell you about him. And I kept telling him it's okay that he's not a scientist, because for me, when I heard his story, the reason I wanted all of you to hear his stories was because as scientists, we spend our whole careers building arsenals that we hope can get implemented. We can tell you why climate change is bad. We can tell you why we don't have the same sort of air conditioning units that we used to. We can tell you what the effect of Roundup on soil is. But then what do we do about it? Who does something about it? Well, it turns out that this guy did something about those things. And it gave me great hope that all of the time and energy we spend as scientists putting together inassailable facts get used by people like this.
Yep.
So that is why it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Tex Harris, diplomat, friend of spies.
Sharon, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. I think I'm going to just turn off lights in the back.
Sure.
Does that work?
Then you can sleep beautifully. The future is not what it used to be. You guys know that. I want to talk today about what we diplomats do is we build arcs. So this is Arc Building 101, dealing with the threats and the realities of climate change in the world today. The key theme of the talk and the key theme of what I want to talk and spread around is that there are no more rewards for predicting rain. There are only rewards for building the ark. And I want to do today three things. I want to talk about the history of arcs, which some of you know a lot about, but I want to bring everybody up. We're going to talk about how the different regimes, climate change regimes, have been built, failed, and rebuilt on different models. Secondly, I want to talk about the Paris Agreement, which is the current model ARC. This is 2015 ARC 4.0. And then lastly, I want to talk about some ideas that we ARC builders are concerned about. This ain't science, but it's the turning of the reality of what you guys have seen in the world into a regime which has the expectation of controlling that in the future. Let's go to work. This all began about 1920 to 25 with large-scale petroleum development in two places, my home state, Texas, and in the Persian Gulf. We started producing massive amounts of hydrocarbons. 61 years ago, that was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we started pumping millions of barrels of oil out of the ground a day. 61 years ago, there was a scientist by the name of Keeling who put a little monitoring device for CO2 atop Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. When he got the first readings, they were 315 parts per million. On the 8th of September, when I last looked, they were 409.25 parts per million. That's an increase of 30% in 61 years. That ends your science lesson. You're into policy for the rest of the talk. All right. First ARC 1.0. The Montreal Protocol, which closed the ozone hole. Serendipity. The world was very concerned, the scientific community was very concerned about a new invention, Concorde aircraft that were going to fly in the stratosphere. Everybody began to wonder what is going to happen when this airplane is flying through the stratosphere. How is it going to affect the Earth? There was a guy from Mexico, very smart guy, by the name of Mario Molino. Anybody know him? He's a great guy. Won a Nobel laureate. He was working in a laboratory for a guy by the name of Sherry Rowland, a very famous guy at UC Irvine. I've been to Irvine. They are so proud that he got a Nobel laureate. Let me tell you, that's a big deal on that campus, and they did good work. So Molina was working on the impacts of CFCs on the environment, all kinds of things, how it interfaces with substance, and all of a sudden people started talking about a Concorde flying through the upper atmosphere, and he said, my God, what's going on up above with CFCs? And he had an idea. He had a scare, he had a nightmare, was that the CFCs, when they floated to the upper atmosphere, with cold temperatures and sunlight, would react free radicals and would set up a chain reaction destroying ozone. Theory. He and Sherry Rowland built a snare drum device which produced low temperatures and low pressures. They put a little CFCs in it, they put a little ozone in it, and they watched what happened, and they had an experiment in a laboratory in Orange County that showed destruction. They wrote a paper for a magazine called Nature, and it was published in 1974. 13 years later, the Montreal Protocol was signed, phasing out the use of ODSs, ozone-depleting substances, around the world. Every nation in the world signed up. That's incredible. That is an achievement for we ARC builders of the greatest significance, and it's just overwhelming. 13 years from publication of the first scientific report to solving a global problem, not bad. Hey, we did well. There was a downside to that. The downside was that it became the gold model, the standard for regime building. Everybody said, hey, we did it for ozone, we can do it for CO2, we can do it for methane, we can do it for all these greenhouse gases, and it'll work. This is the idea that we want. This was the model that the architects, the diplomats, the striped pants set decided would put together. There was something very special about ozone depletion from chlorofluorocarbons. Chlorofluorocarbons are man-made. They're made in, I don't know, 50 factories, 20 factories around the world. They're a man-made substance. They're inventory. We know where they come from. They're easily controllable. The industry fought very successfully, like a cornered dog, to prevent the Europeans and the Americans and the other countries from moving on the ozone treaty until some smart guys at DuPont discovered a substitute. They could replace the chloro with the hydrogen, and it didn't work quite as well. It wasn't as efficient, but it worked, and it didn't have the properties of destroying upper level ozone. They could then end their chloro production line, substitute using hydrogen to produce the same refrigerant, blowing, other agents, the same things that they used it for, and would not have the impact of destroying ozone, which caused significant increases in skin cancer, major impacts on agriculture, and major impacts on the ocean life. So it was a win-win. The industry told the Europeans, ease off. They told the American diplomats, it's okay, go for it. And 13 years later, we had a treaty. One of the victims of that, I was the first guy, I wrote the first speech for my boss, who was the head of EPA, a guy by the name of Russ Train, a very distinguished environmentalist for Richard Nixon. He was Richard Nixon's environmental brain. And we were going to a ministerial at NATO for environmental ministers, and he said, Tex, what do you want me to say? I said, boss, what you really need to do is talk about CFCs. He said, you write it, if I like it, I'll give it. He gave it. It was a slow news day, and it appeared the next day, although he said it in camera that these are my personal views, the press, fake news. It wasn't his personal, they got the story wrong. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency head says ban chlorofluorocarbons. The guys in Delaware were pissed. They were really angry. And so a couple years later, when I was then the number 3 guy in EPA running international activities, I was the first guy fired at EPA by Ann Gorsuch, the mom of our Supreme Court judge. So life goes on. Life goes on. The problem, of course, was that the model was wrong, and we understand that. The benefit was it worked. Everybody signed up. They phased out chlorofluorocarbons, and by 2050, the ozone hole is going to be repaired. All right, let's move on. In 1988, the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP, I don't have to tell you what UNEP is, you guys know, organized something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I know there's some professors here who worked on projects involving that. It is the staff, it is the architectural research team. They are the people who have responsibility to produce information on the physical science, the impact of climate change on man-made and natural systems, and they have also to do assessments of the mitigation options. How do you deal with the greenhouse gas and replace it, and expertise on adaptation. And they, under the Paris Protocol, have been given a new responsibility as the deck crew, they are the bookkeepers of the world. They are the ones under the new Paris Protocol. I'm getting ahead of the story. That's ARC 4.0, but they were developed in not an ARC, but they were hired as staff and just given that responsibility. And so that is very important. Next ARC 2.0, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. 1992, 27 years ago. 27 years ago. 18 months of heart-rending negotiations, signed at Rio. The key parent body, it's a treaty, and the United States signed on to a treaty. I'll talk more about that later. That's very important. What took place was you had a framework convention which everything is attached to. It's like the Christmas tree and all the other initiatives in the world regime dealing with climate change and protecting this planet from the hits that a hot Earth is going to impact on every kind of system that we got, and we got a lot of them, which you guys know all about, is controlled by this one thing. They have COPs. You see this COPs. These are conferences of the parties. So every gathering, major gathering, is a COP. It's a conference of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it is a organizing body headquartered in Bonn, Germany, and they are kind of like the major secretariat and also the initiator of a lot of the regime building work in the United Nations. But the original ARC 2.0 that they built had just voluntary contributions in it for developing countries and developed countries. Now, everybody understands the distinction between the rich and the poor. They're always with us, okay? So people understand that, but what came forward in the development of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was the vast differences between the developed country. Sweden has a little country, enormous hydroelectric power, a different energy mix than the United States or Canada or Australia, which are continental countries, or China, which are continental size places and have vast deposits of coal. Some clean coal, but lots of really filthy brown coal that they use to generate electricity cheaply. So you have differentiation, which came to the fore when they were putting together the Framework Convention. So the builders of that ARC said, screw it, we're not going to be able to have a regime, we'll just have everybody make a voluntary contribution. Well, here you had the EU, which had a very high standard of energy efficiency because all their energy plants had been blown up in World War II, and the Eastern European members of the EU, they were, the thermostat in Eastern Europe was a window. When it got too hot in the room, you opened the window and let a little fresh air in to cool the room off. So they had a primitive, underdeveloped energy system in the East and a modern system in the West. So differentiation ruled, and the Framework Convention developed a voluntary system which angered the EU, the US Greens, and most importantly, a guy, you probably heard of him, Al Gore. Al Gore said, this is not going to work, but we got to have their standards, we got to have rules, we got to have somebody telling people what they've got to do, and he began to push for a new regime which had goals legally binding to be met by nations, and that led to ARC number 3.0, which other people call the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted 22 years ago, 1997, It's ARC 3.0. And what they did there, after years of negotiation, is they split the difference. They said, okay, we're going to have two regimes. We're going to have a regime for the industrial countries, Annex 1 countries they called them, and then Annex 2 countries for the developing countries. China and India raised their hands and said, we are developing countries, so we want to be in Annex 2. We used to have a senator by the name of Byrd. He was the head of the United States Senate for many, many years. Where did he live?
Robert Byrd from the state of West Virginia.
Exactly. What do they do in West Virginia?
Mine coal.
They mine coal. So before the Kyoto, 4 or 5 months before the Kyoto meeting took place, and I've been to Kyoto, the food is delicious, he passed a resolution in the United States Senate, 95-0, saying there shall be no ratification of anything coming out of Kyoto unless India and China are fully on board. That's called a poison pill, because everybody in the world knew that China and India were not going to sign on to a convention which they saw as being a way to penalize their development, their growth, their future, for the way that the West had fracked up the world. Oh, got to tell you a story. We're going to change language. My son worked as a jackaroo in Australia. That's a guy who helps herd sheep. And when he came back there after his 2-month tour, I said, son, you spent 2 months out there, what the hell did you learn? He said, Dad, I learned 3 things. Sheep are the dumbest animals in the world, dogs are the smartest, and the F-U-C-K word is the most common word in the English language. We're going to replace that word. We're going to call frack. So if somebody says they're a climate denier and nothing's going to happen, everything's going to be fine, just tell them frack you and walk away. So I hope you will use that word often and have a fracking good time with it, okay? Good, thank you. So in Kyoto, they had this division in which the India and China and the G77 nations said we won't play ball, so they had 2 annexes. They had rules that were mandatory and binding on the rich guys, except the United States didn't sign on because the Senate would not ratify. Now, if you are a foreigner dealing with the United States building arcs, the United States delegation is excuse the French, a pain in the ass, because the United States has a constitution which requires that treaties made by the United States government have to be ratified by 2/3. 2/3. That's 60. If everybody's there, that's 67 men and women in the U.S. Senate. That's a lot of folks. And you don't need too many people to oppose that to block a Senate. I worked for years on the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. We have not passed that. And I can't remember how many years it's been, but it's been decades that we've not been able to ratify the UN Law of the Sea because we don't have the 2/3 majority. So the U.S. didn't ever sign. The G77 didn't sign. In 2011, Canada discovered they had a vast deposit of oil locked up in tar sands in Alberta, which is just the filthiest oil. I know Venezuelan Orinoco tar sands. These are equally bad. And the Canada had a choice: develop the tar sands or belong to Kyoto. Kyoto was dropped. They withdrew. There was carbon credits and other things. There was mismanagement. There are lots of tales there. But essentially, Kyoto failed. Then we come to the present. We finish history. We're now at ARC 4.0, the current version, December 2015. A guy by the name of Obama went to Paris and twisted arms for a week or two in order to get that through by the skin of its teeth. Now, every regime, every arc, the main thing you got to do if you are the NOAA is you got to get everybody aboard. And the joy of Paris is that almost everybody in the world came aboard. 198 countries came aboard. This week, Russia came aboard. There are now 199 countries. There are two big ones who are out. There is Turkey and Iran, who are both oil producers. I don't know if Turkey's such a major oil exporter, but anyway, they're not in. Those are the two that are still not there. And it went into force very quickly. And the signatories, because you join and then you ratify, so there's a two-step process in belonging. But it's not a treaty, because if it was a treaty, it would have to go to the Senate. It's an accord, which only modifies the framework convention. This is technical details, but to we candy-ass diplomats, that is the vital stuff, because it's the difference between successful adaptation of an international regime or failure. So it's critical that we do that. It represents over 99% of global emissions. So we got almost everybody in the world on the ark, and if you count up all the emissions that are under everybody's control, it's 99%. Victory! We also had a rule book which was passed in very general terms in Paris in 2015, and last December 2018, in Katowice, Poland, which was one of the corners of the Black Triangle, the environmental disaster area in Poland, it was ratified, and so it was the rules were ratified and made specific. Now, the Paris Accord success was based on kind of a hybrid mixed approach to three mega issues that all climate regimes have to face. All ARC designers have got to face these problems. First one, to what extent should the climate change regime be top-down, internationally mandated rules telling you what you got to do, or bottom-up, in which the animals on the ark decide what they're going to pay for their own admission to the ark? Secondly, to what extent should the commitments be uniform for all states, and to what extent should be their differentiated roles? Now, that's not only a question of rich and poor, it's also a question of the different resources that the rich have and the poor have, because the world is not so simple that it's divided just into two chunks. It's divided into hundreds of little chunks that have to make very tough decisions when it comes to meeting energy transition goals. Third, to what extent should the international regime be legally binding? So you had two models out there. You had ARC the Framework Convention, which was freewheeling. You had Kyoto, which was top down on the rich countries. And what Paris did, ARC 4.0, I mean, architects get better. They get smarter. They make progress as they're going along. And so what they did is they adopted a very important principle in international diplomacy. It's called the Goldilocks Principle. They divided it up. They kind of blended a little top-down and a little bottom-up. The most important thing they did is they allowed the countries to declare national determined commitments, NDCs, for their admission to the ark. Every country would say what their contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be in the next 5-year period, and they rolled over every 5 years. But they also agreed that as a group in the Paris Accords, version 4.0 of the ARC. They would all sit down and, based on scientific information, would decide on what the agreed goal in terms of global temperature would be, and emissions would be relative to that for the whole globe. And that they would set up a mandatory scoring system which would follow agreed, open, transparent bookkeeping rules. As you all know, the bookkeepers rule the world. And what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that if you've got agreements, that you have essentially a system which provides accurate information to the bookkeepers so they can make judgments. But the bookkeepers do not issue penalties. They just keep the books. But they make the books open and transparent. Now, this is a little complicated. Not for you guys. You guys are the scientists and you all study this stuff and whatever. The analogy to talk to your aunt or your grandmother is that the difference here is like public television fundraising. There are two major systems that I know of in the world. There's the BBC model, in which every year the United Kingdom government meets with the BBC trustees, and they decide on a license fee. By the way, that's spelled with a CE on the end, not an SE. And you folks in Endeavor Hall should know that. And right now, the price for every residence or every business in the UK, if you have color on your television, it's $200 a year. If you only have black and white TVs, and in Scotland there are some people who have black and white TVs only, it's $67. And the BBC has a database with 30 million addresses in it. So they know all the addresses in the UK and whether you've paid or not paid or what your history is. And they have vans that go around and can look at your residence and during the nighttime viewing hours, figure out whether you've got a TV in there. And in an apartment house, they have a guy who walks around with a little box. He holds it up to your front door, and he knows whether there's a TV playing inside or not. The fine's $1,000. People pay. Now in the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave, we don't do it that way. We have a public broadcasting system called PBS. What do? They ask for your voluntary contribution, and God bless it, if you give, you get a coffee cup. It's wonderful. It's a great system. Now that is the difference between Kyoto and Paris. Okay, Kyoto and the top down says, thou shalt pay, this is your amount, and if you don't do it, we're gonna tell the world, we're gonna shame you. The Paris Accord essentially allows everyone to set the price, their own determination of their price to get aboard the Ark. When you set a standard in which everybody determines what their own price for the voyage is, the cruise, everybody signs up except the Turks and the Iranians. I don't know what's going on there, but anyway, they didn't like that deal. So that's the world we live in. The key secret and the idea that motivates the Paris Accords is ratcheting. The ratcheting up effect. Now in PBS TV, what you have is a total goal for the week of fundraising for your local TV station, and you also have hourly goals. Regime ARC 4.0 is exactly the same. We have the body will agree on what the total goal is, and we will then gather information about all the contributions made by the world 199 members as to how that totals up. We also have a group of scientists telling us what the threats are in terms of temperature, and also other panels that tell us what the impacts are of a world of 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees temperature around the world. And we will then use that to ratchet up the nationally determined contributions of each country. That's the game plan. And you saw the first rollout of that on Monday at the United Nations. And that followed a weekend, last Friday, throughout the world. You had 4 million young people protesting in the streets in every continent in the world except the Antarctic. I don't think there were any protests in the Antarctic. But every place else there were major protests about the failure of the guys in the Ark to do something about global warming. The key issue is ratcheting up. Guterres, the new Secretary General of the United Nations, on last Monday said you cannot speak on climate change before the conference unless you have something to offer. It wasn't quite pay to play or pay to speak, but it was, we're just not going to have people come up and put out a lot of vacuous words. You've got to put something concrete on the table. And the problem was, frankly, that not many people put cutting coal mines down, did not put down transfer of transition goals down. They put down soft stuff. One of my favorites was Boris Johnson, the blonde guy from England, Prime Minister. He came over and he announced $1 billion. I guess Britain's getting so hard these days that they're now determining things in dollars because the pound is sliding so hard. But anyway, it's $1 billion fund for S&T development in mitigation and adaptation for UK industry, which we need. That's a noble cause. But it isn't closing a coal mine in the Midlands. It isn't reducing North Sea oil production, which are greenhouse gas emitters. So everyone is playing the game. Another part of the UN's plan is to use the IPCC. Remember, they were the second part. They were not an arc, but they're the staff. They put out 3 reports in the last few weeks, one on which you should take a look at least the introductions, the 1.5C World on 1.5C climate change report and what happens when it goes hotter. So they did the hotter report. They did another report on the impacts of a hotter planet on the Earth, and another one on the impacts of a hotter planet in the oceans and on the seashores. Devastating stuff. Absolutely devastating stuff, which shows that the problem, as you well know, is not only in the future, but it is now. The impacts are happening now in many, many areas, and the future impacts will be greater and more severe. The game goes on. In December, the next COP, Conference of the Parties, gets together, ratcheting, for a meeting in Santiago. Next year, and the reason we're in Santiago is because the Brazilians just invited us. They were going to have it in Brazil, and then their president changed his policy. He didn't withdraw, as the United States did. If you get a chance, listen to President Trump's statement after the G7, which is the perfect statement of any energy-rich country. I mean, it is the model statement. It is perfect. The statement is, we are rich, we are successful, our wealth is in the ground, and we're not going to give it up on the idea of some goddamn windmills. And That was his statement at the G7, and that is not only his statement, but it's a statement of the Saudis. It's a statement of all these other countries who have trillions of dollars of wealth underground, and they are not prepared to give it up. They will fight to the end. So the process goes on. These are early days, and the problem I have is that for most audiences, when I give this talk, there is a feeling of despair because people do not want their planet's future to be in the hands of a damn regime that involves voluntary contributions and pats on the butt from the international community for doing good work. It's too serious. The problem, I tell you as a diplomat, is that we're not dealing with a class, a group that we have power over. These are all sovereign countries. You guys don't think a lot about sovereign countries. We specialize in thinking about it. They're independent actors. You cannot tell these sons of guns what to do. And inside their country are two debate groups. One are Greens. This lovely 16-year-old young lady from Sweden, fabulous contribution to energize the young people of the world to the threat that the failure to have a really firm, hard ARC mandate reducing greenhouse gases will have on her future and her kids' future, versus the well-connected, well-funded energy barons who are skillful, have spent years funding politicians and organizations and information and newspapers around the world. I'm not talking United States, I'm talking globally. And so there is a real battle. Global emissions, as you know, for 2018 are up. India, I have a slide with the numbers on it, but India is 5-6%, China 3-4%, the United States 2+% they're up. We have not turned any kind of a corner. We are going in the wrong way. The EU is down, but they're in a depression. Many that I talk to are not prepared to wait. They want fast action. This is a problem that took 100 years to build. It took 100 years to develop. The battle lines are being redrawn to ratchet up the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and the answer to that, the alternative to that, is despair. I'm going to stop there. I've got that much more to talk about in terms of specific issues and issues of concern, but they're technical. If somebody wants me to go through it very quickly, I can do it, but I want to hear from you in the last 10-15 minutes that we've got here. It is the model that we have now depends on you as scientists to provide hard information, depends on public opinion to give some backbone to the decision-making leaders in every country in the world who are getting enormous pressures put on them by the people who have enormous financial stakes at risk, at big risk. And also the fact that the timeline is so short and there is such a lack of realization of most in the public to the impacts that are being faced in a short timeline, while the ARC timeline appears to be one of, stated by the Secretary General, of at least a decade in terms of ratcheting up the response. Your and my grandchildren's futures are depending on these common efforts. We got a moral commitment to the planet to leave it habitable for future generations. Please don't frack it up. Yes, ma'am.
So what do you think about whether it's a good idea or not to try to include things like geoengineering in the mix? I mean, I've read stuff that have said that geoengineering is necessary, is going to be necessary to essentially give us more time to work out some of these diplomatic problems. And I've read that if we start messing around with it, it may make things worse, and or it gives people an excuse to put off making a decision.
All right, I'm an ark builder, so you're asking a carpenter for to give you a response on a scientific tough question. What I hear is I'm working down there, below decks, caulking the between the beams, is that right now there are no geoengineering solutions that are certain and are proven workable. It's really an enormous crapshoot. And the question is, where do you put your resources? One of the big problems that we have, this is one of my big idea concerns. It's not just, we focus so much on the transition to a less carbon intensive world, because we're always going to need carbon to lubricate the wheels and make plastics and do other things. But we got to take it away from cars, we got to take it away from electricity, and we got to take it away from agriculture, because agriculture has learned very smartly is the way to produce food is through petroleum. I mean, it's a wonderful, magical thing that our food today, the major ingredient in the food today is petroleum in different aspects. And some sunshine too, but that's a freebie. But from the man-made products that we put in, where you put your money is key. So you have now major backlash, not just from the economic interests, but from nationalistic interests in all these countries in the world who are saying, frack you, Paris Accords. You want to put pressure on me to make decisions? I'm not going to agree to any kind of system which is going to tell me, a proud sovereign country of Ruritania, what I ought to do with my resources. Frack you. Secondly, you have libertarian forces who see this as a major upending of markets, because they see this as global, the UN blue helmets coming in the form of climate police or climate control, threatening the economic libertarian market principles which they believe as an ideology should govern the world. Global engineering, if we essentially go down a path of global engineering, then you're going to bring in another group against it, which are the defense industry, because we're not going to be able to prepare for a war with China, as we're in the process of doing now, if we also have to do geoengineering plus trillions of dollars for putting seawalls around Manhattan and Miami Beach. So there's only so much money in the pot. And these groups are not just looking at the rich, poor, we got oil, we don't have oil, my island's going underwater. The major issues that we talk about, they're looking at this long term and realize that the finite resources that are there are baked in terms of these decisions that are tied up in arc design. And so we arc designers we were caulking between the wood, are looking out there at these other mega force storms that are coming at us to disrupt regime building in the future. Sir.
I'm interested about how the ratcheting is going to work, since you mentioned
I missed a word.
how
How
the ratcheting up is going to work. And like, since you mentioned Boris Johnson, I think like he's probably an extreme example. I mean, he might not be in power next week, let alone in like 2030. So like, you know, he can come to these things and, like you say, he can commit to something that sounds like a lot of money at one of these conferences, but then the Conservative government's still supportive of rolling out fracking in a big way in the UK. So like, I don't quite see what the pressure, even if it gets ratcheted, I don't see what the pressure on him is, because they're thinking so short term.
ratcheting is the key. And by the way, the Secretary General, as you know, if you're a golfer, a baseball player, and whatever your sport is, you look at other guys who really have a beautiful swing, and you admire their swing. You know, you're not competing with them, but you're just admiring. Guterres is brilliant. He's just brilliant, because what he's got to do is walk the very fine line between saying it's all voluntary, but there's pressure for you to ratchet. So it's a different kind, and he says it is not name and shame yet. But the name and shame, because we have built into the Paris Accords, ARC 4.0, an accounting system which will take the goal, put the goal up. This is PBS TV. This is your weekly fundraiser. Put the goal up and put the meager contributions that have been made this hour and say, oh God, I gotta kick in my $50 because they're $4,000 short and they only have 3 minutes left to go. So you pick the phone up. That's the idea. That's the idea. And what you really need is a total change in mindset. When a diplomatic regime, climate regime builder gets off an airplane, wherever the conference is, Paris, Santiago, whatever it is, she is thinking in her mind, what I have got to do is to ensure my country's place in the first class cabin on the Ark at the least price. Okay? It's cruise booking. What you want to do is you want the cabin with the big window and the balcony, and you want to pay the least amount of money for it. That mindset has got to change. What we've got to do is to convince the Ark builders, the mandators, that what's at stake is so big that what they've got to do is try to save the planet from a 3-degree or 4-degree future. So when they get off the airplane, they're not thinking about the first class cabin at the economy price, which is what most of them are thinking about today. What they're thinking about is, what can my country do in ways of contribution? Not everybody has coal, not everybody has fossil fuels, not everybody's a greenhouse gas emitter on a net basis. What can they do? And that is the change. Now the governments will change, but what has to change, and to do that, is public opinion. And there are two kinds of public opinion. There's a public opinion which is the broad public, the mass public. And there's also the opinion which affects elites. Those are both politicians and economic elites in all the countries. And so what you need is essentially a sales strategy, a ratcheting up strategy, which works on both levels. That it works on the public level of popular press information, and it also works on the level of impacting elite players and elite commercial interests. Exxon Mobil is today in favor of action on climate change. So those, after years of fighting it, so but they have major investment now and major resources and spent billions and billions of dollars in terms of algae and other kinds of things that you see on their ads, but they're doing it. So the issue is not just short term in terms of Boris and the government, it's bigger than that. It's changing a mindset. It's changing a direction of how people approach the problem. If people are still trying to get the first class cabin on the Ark at the budget price, we are fracked. Sir.
Yes. First of all, I have an observation and a question. First of all, I want to thank you for coming and giving an enormously valuable seminar. It was good to hear, and I think more people need to hear it. Last year, and I'm not completely sure of the person, I think it was Michael Mann's talk here last year. He talked about saying, how long will it take to change the world? How long will it take to make this resolution? And an old man in the front row said 4 years. And the guy said, 4 years? How could it possibly take 4 years? He says, in World War II, in 1937, 1938, we remade the economy of the United States of America in 4 years because the country recognized an existential threat. And I think maybe that's an important lesson to learn.
Thank you. That's the mindset.
Now, my question. I got so many notes I took. I was sitting here typing on the phone all day. So I think more people need to hear what you just said. So with regards to tactics, I went searching on the web to see if you'd given a TED Talk, and the only thing I determined was that you had excellent taste in suspenders. So would you consider condensing this down to 18 minutes?
That's one of my goals, and I thank Sharon for getting me started on this project, but I would like to give a TED Talk. The problem I had, what really got me PO'd about this initially in my conversation with Sharon, and we had a wonderful Mexican dinner with mariachis. It was a great evening, but a very good substantive one too, was that everyone in the world is concerned about a polar bear on an ice floe. You see it? Everybody blink your eye, you see it. You see that picture. Everybody in the world is fascinated by calving glaciers in Greenland. My God. Have you seen the ones from the Antarctic where a quarter of a mile of ice or a half a mile of ice falls into the ocean, causing a huge wave? I mean, that is television. That is something really dramatic. No one is concerned about building arcs. The theme of today's talk is there is no more reward for predicting the rain, only for building the ark. And we've got to focus on the ark building because it's critical to the future. Last question. Two questions here. Let me take them both and I'll try to answer them both. Go ahead, sir.
Short question. Is this arc going to keep floating once we get off of it in a year? The U.S. is supposed to withdraw on November 4 next year.
What happens is the date of withdrawal is 2 or 3 days after an event. I forget what it's called. I think it's called an election. I think it's called an election. So Tom Friedman wrote a piece. I'm sorry, I was going to do two, but his question was so intriguing that I jumped on it. Thank you. Tom Friedman wrote a piece, an op-ed this last week. He said, it's the environment, stupid. As you remember, Bill Clinton, who's a bald guy from Louisiana,
Carville. James Carville.
Yes. And he had a statement they wrote on the Little Rock War Room that said, it's the economy, stupid. And Friedman said, it's the environment, stupid. The problem is that the environment does not poll well. So American politics is not run by the importance of the issue, it's run by the importance of the voters' concerns. And the voters are concerned about health care. So what you have is the Democrats are talking about different systems of health care and not talking about a cleavage issue. Well, there's a cleavage issue there between the Republicans and the Democrats, but this campaign could be, I'm not sure that it will be, I doubt if it will be, on the environment, because the difference between American participation in the, not just the Paris Accord process, but in the whole arc building thing is critical. We are not a power. We cannot tell people what to do. That's a mistake. We don't have the authority. We don't have the clout. Those days are behind us. After the Second World War, we might have had that clout. We don't today. But we do have clarity of thinking. The only major drawback we have is this damn treaty process we have, where we need 2/3 agreement of the Senate to ratify whatever we come up with. But it is terribly important to have American leadership at the table doing its share. Obama and his team, Gore and his team, had major impacts. I'm saying not just as American, but in terms of the dynamics of the process. Last question.
Some of the Democratic candidates have said that the first thing they would do in office is to re-enter the Paris Accord. What do you think the response from the international community would be, ranging from, sure, welcome back, we'll just forget about the past and go forward, to, no, we don't know if we can really trust you anymore, the U.S. doesn't really have a voice in this on an international scale?
I think the withdrawal from Paris was significant. I think it will probably be, they actually haven't withdrawn. They've just announced the intention to withdraw. They can't withdraw until a couple of days after the election. So we're still there. We're actually sending people to the COP meeting in San Diego who will sit at a table behind a U.S. sign and speak. But it's interesting, the representatives that we have, if you look at this administration's climate change domestic agenda, and I'm leaving things out, the one that really gets in my craw is the proposal to withdraw the regulations governing the wellhead control of release of methane. That is just putting global greenhouse gas poison directly in the atmosphere. And my little look at that sees that the major contributor to downside of the gas revolution is the leakage at the wellhead. That's been the biggest thing. Opening ANWR, lifting the restrictions on air quality, which will allow enormous coal mines to continue another 5-10 years of production before they meet start to impact on the lower air quality standards. We're taking away California's right to lower the automobile emission standards, and the list goes on and on. I mean, the U.S. ambassador to the UN is the wife of a coal baron. I mean, it's very tough. Thank you, guys.
So I know that there were other questions. There's pizza, and Tex is quite happy to talk to any of you. His business cards are up front, so if you wanted to continue a conversation.
Send me emails.
I know, but like that. So.
That was good.